Hi, and welcome to Really Understanding Incoterms 2020, a series of comprehensive masterclasses. I'm Bob Ronai, and this is Lesson 5, Part 2 of FCA, Free Carrier, Named Place of Delivery. But first, the disclaimer. I am not a lawyer. The contents of this course are not legal advice. I was a member of the International Chamber of Commerce's Incoterms 2020 drafting group, which created these rules. Some of the contents in this presentation are direct quotes from the Incoterms 2020 publication. My explanations, my comments, and my opinions are based on my knowledge and my experience of over 5 decades. My intent in creating this comprehensive course on Incoterms 2020 is to ensure that my knowledge and my experience is passed on to you for a better future for you in trade. In this lesson, we'll continue with FCA. We're going to look at the strange A6 and B6 delivery transport document and A9, B9 allocation of costs. As always, I will explain what the book says first, but then I will examine the issues arising from these articles as we go along. A6 delivery transport document. The seller must provide the buyer at the seller's cost with the usual proof that the goods have been delivered in accordance with A2. The seller must provide assistance to the buyer at the buyer's request, risk and cost in obtaining a transport document. Where the buyer has instructed the carrier to issue to the seller a transport document under B6, the seller must provide any such document to the buyer. Just repeating those first 2 lines. These 2 sentences demonstrate 2 distinctly different documents. The first refers to a document from the buyer's carrier, indicating their receipt of the goods delivered to them by the seller and issued at the point of delivery. The second refers to the seller assisting the buyer in getting a transport document. After all, it is the buyer who contracted for carriage and is the shipper. The third sentence is a new concept, but was not at all well thought out. The buyer contracts for carriage and should be the shipper on the transport document. But if the seller is given a transport document for letter of credit purposes, it then is obliged to provide that transport document back to the buyer via its bank. This, though, is relevant to negotiable bills of lading, but in fact is irrelevant to airway bills and land transport documents, which are not required by the buyer to receive the goods and are not negotiable documents. It does not explain how the seller could endorse a bill of lading unless it is shown as the shipper, even though it has no contractual arrangement with the carrier and would unwittingly take on potential liabilities to do with carriage of the goods. B6, the buyer must accept the proof that the goods have been delivered in accordance with A2. If the parties have so agreed, the buyer must instruct the carrier to issue to the seller, at the buyer's cost and risk, a transport document stating that the goods have been loaded, such as a bill of lading with an on-board notation. Let's look at that again. This paragraph tries to deal with letters of credit and sellers usually needing an on-board bill of lading. But the Incoterms 2020 rules are about mutual obligations between the seller and the buyer. So saying if the parties have so agreed is redundant. They can agree anything in their contract. There can be no obligation under these rules between the seller and the buyer's carrier. The seller has no remedy if the buyer's carrier fails to act in accordance with the buyer's instructions, whatever they might be, or gives the seller an unsuitable document. If the vessel's loading and departure are delayed, the seller will have a similar delay in receiving the bill of lading and therefore payment for the goods, even though they have already delivered and would expect payment. If the container is damaged after leaving the seller's premises and does not get loaded at all, the seller will not receive an onboard bill of lading, even though they have delivered and will not be able to comply with the buyer's letter of credit. Allocation of costs. The seller must pay all costs relating to the goods until they have been delivered in accordance with A2, other than those payable by the buyer under B9. B, the cost of providing the usual proof to the buyer under A6 that the goods have been delivered. And where applicable, duties, taxes and any other costs related to export clearance under A7A, and the buyer for all costs and charges related to providing assistance in obtaining documents and information in accordance with B7A, export formalities. The buyer must pay, A, all costs relating to the goods from the time they have been delivered under A2, other than those payable by the seller under A9. And the buyer must pay the seller for all costs and charges related to providing assistance in obtaining documents and information in accordance with A4, which is carriage, A5, A6 and A7B. At C, where applicable, the buyer must pay duties, taxes and any other costs related to transit or import clearance under B7B, and D, any additional costs incurred either because 1, the buyer fails to nominate a carrier or another person under B10, or 2, the carrier or person nominated by the buyer under B10 fails to take the goods into its charge, provided that the goods have been clearly identified as the contract goods. So clearly we need to examine this in much more detail. These articles are clear that the seller pays the costs for export formalities. The seller pays costs only until delivery, whether loaded at their premises or not unloaded at other premises. All other costs beyond delivery are for the buyer, including transport, terminal charges, port charges, freight, etc. Who pays the costs of security-related matters will depend on when and where they occur, before or after delivery. The buyer pays the cost for issue of the transport document. FCA and letters of credit. How does an LC function with an FCA transaction? It doesn't, not in the normal form. LCs almost invariably specify a port of loading, port of discharge, latest date of shipment, and require presentation of an onboard bill of lading. None of these are the seller's responsibility. So an LC for an FCA transaction should only require presentation of the seller's invoice and a copy of the buyer's or carrier's cargo receipt, or a received for shipment bill of lading. However, the buyer already has control of the goods. The seller is not the shipper, though it is the exporter because it carried out export formalities. Unfortunately, there is no provision in the SWIFT LC MT700 format for latest date of receipt of goods by the carrier. So as a buyer, what do I request my bank to state in the LC? Only field 44A, place of taking in charge, and field 44B, place of final destination. They are not to show 44E, port of loading, or 44F, port of discharge. They are not to show field 44C, latest date of shipment. It should require presentation of a forwarder's cargo receipt, dated no later than whenever, showing place of receipt and place of final destination, instead of an onboard bill of lading. In summary, this rule is the one that describes what most people think is ex-works. When they talk about ex-works, almost invariably, they are actually thinking FCA. This rule is suitable for any mode or modes of transport. The seller loads the buyer's vehicle or delivers to the terminal. The seller carries out export formalities, but the seller does not ship. The buyer contracts for carriage. The buyer's risk commences within the seller's country before the goods cross the border. This rule is not compatible with letters of credit because the seller does not control how, when, from or to where the goods are being shipped. B6, frankly, is useless and pointless. Next lesson, we will look at CPT and CIP. We'll look at the more complex and confusing articles, again, A2 and B2, delivery and taking delivery. Then for each rule, we'll look at A6, B6, the delivery and transport document, A9 and B9, allocation of costs, and A10, B10, notices. We'll look at CPT first and then insurance under CIP. As always, I will explain what the book says first, which is where other trainers and YouTube videos usually stop. But then I will examine the issues arising from these articles as we go along. This has been a complex lesson, and I recommend you look at it a second and maybe a third time. If you like this lesson, please click on the thumbs up button below. If you'd like to be alerted to each new lesson, please hit the subscribe button and the bell. And please feel free to leave any comments and questions relevant to this lesson below. Till next lesson.